I'm here with Mike Roloff from Northwestern University, and Mike has had a very long and distinguished career studying the dynamics of conflict interaction, and so I'm delighted to learn more about that from you today. To start, what kind of drew you to a career studying conflict behavior?
Actually, it started, the genesis of my interest in conflict started way back when I was in junior high school. From the time I was in junior high school, through college, I was involved in forensic activities, debate. And the core of debate's argument. And through that process, I learned that there could be clash and that people needed to give reasons and evidence for what they wanted. It was a little unrealistic because at the end there was usually a judge who said who was right. And of course in life, unfortunately, there's no judge to tell you who's right and who's wrong. But it really began because of that give and take. And then by the time I got to college, I became a little less interested in the activity of forensic debate because, again, I've been doing it for so long. But I still remained interested in influence, so I was working with a guy as an undergraduate who was studying persuasion and attitude change. And so I became more interested in that process. And then I went to graduate school intending to study that. And as luck would have it, by the time I got to graduate school, nobody was much interested in persuasion anymore. And I became interested in what I thought was a more realistic phenomenon, which, again, going back to the unrealistic context of debate, which involved mutual influence instead of one-way stuff. Because a lot of the persuasion research still, I think, looks at sort of the passive receiver, active source that presents a message to somebody who might counter-argue inside their head, but won't say anything to the individual. And it always struck me that, at least my life never worked that way, that when I wanted somebody to do something and they didn't want to do it, they'd tell me. And so there was a lot more give and take that went with that, which automatically meant I became interested in disagreement, given conflict and disagreement or with each other. It was sort of a natural process for me anyway, going from sort of the forensic activities to learning how to study it as a researcher, and at the same time living in an environment filled with conflict. So I had to learn how to, there's an old saying that academics study what they're not good at, and I've spent my entire life trying to understand how to be influential, apparently. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So influence is what you're not good at, but you're good at conflict, do you?
Yeah, well, I'm good at studying it.
Okay.
My wife tells me that I teach a class in negotiation. And she likes to tell people I study it, but she doesn't. And so we have a very functional relationship that way, that I sort of sit back and let her negotiate everything and watch what she does, as well as other people.
Case study.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I'm learning through personal observation.
Well, why is conflict important for us to study in interpersonal behavior?
Well, I think, as I came into the field, there was a very optimistic view of conflict at the time, that it was coming out of the late 1960s where social change and so forth was created through conflict and confrontation. And there was this sort of, I believe, naive belief that conflict was always good. And then I think as we've gone along and looked at it, I think the importance of conflict, unfortunately, is not because it's good, it's because you're trying to avoid the things that are bad about it. And unfortunately, there are some bad things about it. We know that there's research out there that says that the more often that husbands and wives fight, the greater the probability of the divorce. And that seems to be true regardless of how they fight. The old fallback always was, if you just use the right, appropriate technique, you can avoid the relational harm. But I've seen a couple of studies where it's just purely the frequency of argument that creates the problem. I taught my conflict class in the spring. And in preparation for one of the lectures, I went to the website for the FBI where I was looking at homicides. And in 2009, based on the limits of their data, 25% of the homicides in the United States escalated from an argument. And that was a larger percentage than the number of homicides that occurred from gang violence and other things that I think we hear more about on television. And I think people I think in a day-to-day environment, we understand arguing and conflict has an averse reaction to it. I think sometimes academics forget that. And I think the reason we need to study it, as I said, unfortunately, is not because of the positive aspects. It's because of the potential downside of conflict. And if you have to add to that, the fact that people, even in very, very positive relationships, find things to fight about, mm-hmm. it's very hard to avoid it. Mm-hmm. So if it's both inevitable and generally bad, then we need to study it to figure out how do you contend with this almost imperative of part of being in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Do you think people can learn to do it better?
I think they can avoid doing it bad.
Okay.
That's one of the things that over time I've become convinced about when it comes to arguing, is that we know an awful lot about how to do it badly. Mm-hmm. I don't think we know as much about how to do it effectively. Mm-hmm. In my conflict class, I have a particularly depressing part of a lecture that I call How to Get a Divorce. Uh-huh. And it's not how to get a divorce in an effective way, but how to make sure that your marriage ends in divorce. And there's firm evidence out there. If you want to destroy your marriage, I can tell you how to do it.
Right.
You know, we can just come up with a list of things. We can over-determine destruction of a marriage. Uh-huh. But if you had me up there and say, now, what do you do? Okay, you shouldn't do the following things, but what you do? There's not as much evidence to say this is what you should do, but there's clear evidence what you shouldn't do. And I think that's incredibly important for the study of conflict, is that we still need to identify what you shouldn't do, but I think what's harder to study is what you should do.
I agree. So looking back on your body of work, what do you think are the one or two really important findings that have come out of your research?
I think they sort of link together in a series of generalizations. What I've tried to do over time is to become more pragmatic and realistic about what you find, or what I found, rather. And so I put them together in sort of a summary. The first one that comes out of the research that we've done is that people are annoying. I know no one likes to hear that because no one thinks they're annoying, but that's because of the second reason. People won't tell you you're annoying. That when we ask people, you know, when you're involved with somebody, what it is that you find irritating about them, they have no trouble telling us. Sometimes they will actually turn the sheet over. We give them 10 lines and they start filling in 11, 12 on the next page. They got a bunch of things. And then we ask them, what have you told your partner about? And very few of them they told the partner about. So people sort of live in this illusion of perfection that, you know, I don't annoy anyone, but I know they annoy me. And no one's really telling anyone about that. And oftentimes for reasons that turn out to be functional. In communication for a long time there was view that people who were conflict avoiders were weak personalities, didn't know how to speak up, Casper Milquetoast kinds of characters. But if you look at the reasons why people are not complaining, they've got good reasons, because they're true. You can actually hurt your relationship if you disclose certain things about your partner you find annoying, and people will say, I don't want to hurt my relationship. Sometimes they're trivial. Sometimes people say they don't address them because the partner won't change, and they won't. And so you start looking for the reasons why people are withholding. They make sense. And under some conditions, it becomes functional to just withhold those things. Now, the other part of the equation is that when you do confront people, on the short term it works reasonably well. I think that, not research I did, but others did, when they bring in husbands and wives and let them interact over a variety of things, the most frequent influence technique is to ask. And it's the most successful. A high percentage of requests are granted in a marriage, even in the unhappy ones.
Right.
Most of them are granted. Where communication falls apart is when you meet resistance. And that's where arguing comes in. That once people typically grant your request in a close relationship without you having to even give many reasons for it. They just do it. But when they say no, it becomes very, very difficult. And that's when you start getting into a pattern of constant arguing. And that's what becomes dysfunctional. It becomes dysfunctional for the relationship. Some of the work that I've done is on serial arguing, where people continue arguing over the same thing. And they often have very different viewpoints of whether they're making any progress or not. One of the things that gets really bad about a serial argument is when you know you're saying the same thing and you can predict what your spouse is going to say before your spouse starts speaking. So there's a scripted aspect to it where you're just grinding it over and over. And then you add to that that constant arguing at some point can make you sick. You know, it begins to stress you out. So it becomes not only a problem for the relationship, but for your own physical and psychological well-being to do this. And so at that point, you begin to ask the question, is it worth it? Now, the next issue, the one that I personally want to start moving ahead on, is that if arguing becomes dysfunctional at some point, they've reached an impasse, and then the question becomes, what do? Well, you can end the relationship, which is costly, and in the grand scheme of things, there may be reasons to stay in that relationship despite the fact you can't agree on this issue. So what is it that you can do to sustain the relationship in the face of disagreement that cannot be resolved? Well, it takes a lot of maturity to be able to agree to disagree. Yeah. Because as soon as you agree to disagree, you're still acknowledging there's disagreement, so you've got to learn to live with it. Initially, the psychologists were saying, well, forgive. And there's some data out there to say that when you forgive somebody, it's good for you. I mean, it takes away some of the stress. But there's some other data that's just come out recently. I didn't collect the data, but others have, that indicates that people who forgive too much are taken advantage of by their partners. The partner doesn't learn a thing. The partner says, whoa, you know, and they just become worse.
Right.
So forgiveness doesn't seem to me to be the answer. When I was teaching at the Family Institute at Northwestern, there was a therapy they were using in couples therapy that was called acceptance. And the idea behind acceptance, as the therapists were working on it, is not that the annoying aspect of your partner is something that you view as okay. You actually be pleased if they just quit plain doing it. Yeah. Okay? So it's not, you know, capitulating.
Right.
It still irritates you. Yeah. But understanding that the level at which it occurs is acceptable, given the nature of the relationship. And then trying to get individuals not to forgive, but to say, live with this.
You think that's easier to do with smaller issues than
big issues?
Big issues?
And, you know, my argument is that there are deal breakers. Anybody who goes into a relationship has to know what the deal breakers are. I think domestic violence is a deal breaker. I think, now this one people disagree on because we've got notable public examples. I'd argue that infidelity is a deal breaker. Yet we know of particularly public couples that seem to have found ways of coping with infidelity. So I think people do have deal breakers where they say, yeah. But one of the things that I cover in my conflict class, I found this study where they were doing a projection analysis of the likelihood of getting divorced or separated, and they were looking at factors that predicted that over like a 5-year period of time. Well, some of the things that predict make sense. Alcoholism, criminal behavior, drug addiction, infidelity, domestic violence, all those things make sense. But one factor that predicted getting a divorce or separated over that period of time was my partner has irritating personal habits. Oh. I'm sorry. I mean, you know, people complain about the divorce rate as it is. If people are getting divorced because their partners have irritating personal habits, why isn't the divorce rate higher? Yeah. Because I think everybody has annoying personal, and that's
presumably you know about them before you get married.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's the repetition, the fact that you know, there used to be this view that you got used to them. And then I saw this study. Admittedly, it was a cross-sectional study, so it was not longitudinal. But as you well know, you can't study, you know, marriages over the long haul because no one would ever get tenure. You never have enough publications to be able to do it. This is a long period of time. Right. It's infeasible. So what you have to do is to compare them at different levels. Well, one of the arguments somebody had made is that the longer you're married, the more tolerant you become. Well, in a cross-sectional design, they found the longer you were married, the less tolerant you became. And that becomes a bit of a hassle. Now, the way to get around that, though, is you might become intolerant, but you could at least say it's not worth fighting about. And the hope, I think, that perhaps you're seeing in some of the longer marriages is people learn to pick their battles. Right. And I think that ultimately is what you have is a takeaway for everybody is communication's not a magic elixir when it comes to arguing. I'm sorry, I don't care what the conflict books say or anything like that. It's really good at solving coordination problems, immediate minor problems, adjustment things that I'm not saying are irrelevant. I think when you get married or get in any kind of semi-permanent relationship, you have to learn to adjust your behavior. And communication does a good job of coordinating that. And as I said, for the majority of those hassles during the day, communication solves them. But when it turns into an argument, when there is resistance, communication is not an especially effective tool at overcoming those things. And that's where you have to learn to pick your arguments. This is worth fighting over, and this is not worth fighting over. This is worth learning to accept. And this is, okay, it's a deal breaker. This one's got to be resolved, or I'm out of here.
Right. So communication is not the magic bullet.
It is not. As much as I wish it was 35 years ago when I came into the field, 35 years later, I can tell you, not so much.
Yeah, not always. So based on what you've learned in your career about interpersonal communication, what advice do you have for students in terms of careers they might explore or how to apply interpersonal communication research to their daily experiences that they have with people in their lives?
Yeah, I think there are two parts to the question. One is career, and it seems to me there are several career paths. The most direct, obviously, is to become what we are, which is college professors, which has both advantages and disadvantages, as we know. That it's possible to go the academic route and to go on to get a master's, to get a PhD, and become a researcher. My assumption is the vast majority of people aren't interested in that. The other is to look into more of an applied profession, and then you have to figure out what are the professions that really build on issues related to conflict. One is the couples therapy. Like I said, I worked at the Family Institute for a while at Northwestern, where you can get a degree that is focused on how do we help. It used to be, it was just marriage, but now because people are cohabitating and there's a variety of types of relationships, just couples therapy. You can get trained to do that. A couple of years of intense training and some practice and so forth. It's probably the most direct equivalent of the research findings for what we have when it comes to a profession. Then the other alternative is that you have to sort of translate the interpersonal conflict stuff into other, professions that are indirectly brushing up against it. So human resources and organizations oftentimes have to deal with disputes between superiors and subordinates. I think some organizations have understood that they have to be aware of the impact that jobs having on marriages and relationships outside the job.
Right.
Because if somebody's unhappy at home, they're probably not going to do a very good job at work.
Right.
And so
and if they're not happy at work, they're not going to be very happy at home.
That interdependency between those things become very, very, and even now, given people are waiting so long to get married, they're going to have romantic relationships on the job and fraternization and other things. Human resources has to figure out how to deal with.
Right.
So those become sort of people jobs. And then, of course, you've got the other people jobs like social work and things like that, where you can apply it. There are people professions, and I think the interpersonal conflict stuff sort of leads directly to those. How do you do it in your own life? And I think that becomes even stickier because it does require a level of self-awareness as well as just knowledge of what the stuff says. And it's one thing to know what I should do, and it's another thing to do it. When I taught at the Family Institute, one of the things the therapists often complained about is that they could get a couple to come into a therapy session. They would have them rehearse interacting in a positive way. They could do it in the session, and then they sent them home and they went right back to their old bad habits.
Right.
So it's one thing to know what you should do. It's another thing to be able to actually do it when you're in the routine context where you've been behaving poorly. And I think that is a major task for people in trying to translate that. When I teach my conflict class, I often do get students who will say it's common sense, that you're not really surprising me much. The problem is I don't know how to do it. I know what I'm supposed to do, and I get so angry and caught up in the moment, the bad habits just come flying out. And that's what I was saying earlier about why communication is not the magic bullet, because it's one thing it can make someone aware.
Yeah.
And they probably were aware to begin with,
right.
Frankly. Most of us are not that out of touch. But it's not very effective at showing us how I should be able to control what I'm doing.
Right.
And telling me I should know probably just offends me and makes me less likely to want to do it. So that becomes really, really a difficult thing for students. One thing I would warn them about, something I learned very early in my marriage, is the worst thing you can do in an argument is to look at the other person and say, research indicates. So I strongly urge you not, in an argument, to look at the other person and say, I'm going to draw on research to explain to you why what you're doing is actually messed up and making our relationship worse.
So even the expert on conflict
it does not work. That just gets you in more trouble than it's possibly worth. So now stifle. I think self-control and stifle is the next area of research, along with acceptance. I intend to do is how can people learn to stifle their thoughts without expressing them. Just let it go.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us and to fill us in on your outstanding body of research and all the things you've learned about conflict along the way. And if you'd like to learn more about conflict, you can read about Dr. Roloff's work in the chapter on conflict in our textbook.